Most strange things that happen while camping stay in the woods where they belong. You might hear something outside the tent, see an animal acting strangely, or feel like something is watching you from the tree line. Then you pack up, drive home, and life goes back to normal. At least that's what I used to think. But a few years ago, after a camping trip in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, something we saw out there didn't stay in the mountains. One of us started seeing it again weeks later. Not in the forest, outside his house in Kansas. My name is Mark Delaney. I live in Wichita, Kansas, and I work as a mechanic. In the summer of 2021, 3 friends and I planned a camping trip out to Colorado. It was something we tried to do at least once a year when everyone could get time off work. The group was pretty small. Just me, my friend Tyler, another guy named Jason, and Tyler's cousin Eric. Tyler was the one who suggested the location that year. He had gone hiking in the San Juan Mountains a few years earlier and said there were a lot of quiet areas where you could camp without dealing with crowds. We loaded up 2 trucks with gear and drove out there over a weekend. It took about 10 hours from Kansas to reach the mountains, but once we got there it was worth the trip. The area Tyler chose was a remote national forest campground that only had a few basic sites and a dirt road leading to it. There were tall pine trees everywhere and a small clearing where people usually set up tents. When we arrived late that afternoon, there was only one other truck parked a sight down the road. Other than that, it was quiet. We set up camp, started a small fire, and spent the evening talking and cooking food. Nothing unusual happened that first night. The next morning, we went hiking along a trail that ran through the forest and eventually climbed up a ridge overlooking a valley. The scenery was exactly what you picture when you think about Colorado mountains. Thick forest, rocky slopes, and long stretches where you couldn't see any roads or buildings. Later that afternoon, we returned to the campsite. That was when Jason noticed something strange. About 50 yards away from the clearing, a deer was standing between 2 trees. At least we thought it was a deer at first. The animal was watching us very closely. Normally deer run away the moment they notice people nearby, especially when there are 4 of them making noise around a campsite. This one didn't move. It just stood there staring at us. Tyler grabbed his phone and zoomed in a little to look at it. That's when he said something that caught everyone's attention. He said the legs looked wrong. We all looked more carefully. The animal definitely looked like a deer, but the proportions seemed off somehow. The legs were longer and thinner than normal. Then something even stranger happened. The deer took a few steps forward, but the movement didn't look right. Instead of the smooth motion deer usually have, the legs bent in an awkward way like it was struggling to move correctly. Eric joked that maybe it was injured, but the animal didn't seem injured. It just kept standing there watching us. After a minute, it slowly walked behind some trees and disappeared deeper into the forest. We all assumed it was just a strange-looking deer and went back to what we were doing. That night we stayed up around the fire talking and drinking a little. Around midnight the temperature dropped enough that we decided to turn in. Tyler and I shared one tent while Jason and Eric used another. Sometime during the night I woke up suddenly. At first I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent. Not heavy steps like a person walking. Lighter than that, like something pacing slowly around the campsite. I listened for a minute and heard it again. Soft steps moving across the ground near the tents. I assumed it was probably a deer or a raccoon looking for food. Then I heard Tyler whisper from the other side of the tent. He said quietly that something was outside. I asked him if he thought it was a bear. He said no. He said whatever it was sounded like it was walking around the tents over and over. We both stayed still and listened. The footsteps continued circling the campsite for several minutes. Eventually they moved farther away toward the trees. After that everything went quiet again. The next morning we told Jason and Eric about it. Jason said he heard something too, but assumed it was an animal passing through. Eric said he didn't hear anything. We spent most of that day hiking again and then packed up camp in the afternoon. Before we left, Tyler walked out toward the area where we saw the deer the day before. A few minutes later, he called us over. There were tracks in the dirt. At first they looked like deer tracks, but the spacing between them was strange. Some of the prints were much farther apart than they should have been for a deer walking normally. Jason joked that maybe it was a mutant mountain deer. We all laughed about it and didn't think much more about it during the drive home. After we returned to Kansas, life went back to normal for a few weeks. Then Tyler called me late one night. He sounded nervous. He asked if I remembered the deer we saw in Colorado. I said of course I did. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. He said he thought he had seen the same thing outside his house. Tyler lived on the edge of town, near a field. He said a few nights earlier, he was letting his dog out in the backyard when he noticed an animal standing near the fence line. At first he thought it was a deer wandering through the neighborhood, but when the porch light turned on, the animal didn't run away. Instead, it stood there staring at him. Tyler said the legs looked too long, just like the deer in Colorado. Then the animal slowly walked away toward the field. I told him it was probably just a normal deer and his mind was connecting it to the camping trip. That explanation made sense at the time, but 2 nights later he called again. This time he sounded even more shaken. He said the same animal came back. It stood in the field behind his house for several minutes, watching the backyard. He said the way it moved looked exactly like the one we saw in the mountains. After that night, Tyler installed motion lights and a small security camera facing the backyard. A few days later, the camera recorded something. The footage showed a deer standing near the fence, but the animal looked unusually tall. The video wasn't clear enough to see details. The most unsettling part was what happened next. The deer suddenly turned its head toward the camera. Then it stepped backward out of the light and disappeared. Tyler showed the footage to the rest of us. Jason tried to explain it as a normal deer caught at a strange angle. Eric didn't say much about it, but Tyler was convinced it was the same animal we saw in Colorado. A few weeks later, he moved to a different part of town closer to the city. After they said he never saw the animal again. I still think about that trip sometimes, because I've been camping all over the country since then, and I've seen plenty of deer in the woods, but none of them ever stood and watched people the way that one did, and none of them moved the way it did either. The strange part isn't what we saw in the mountains. The strange part is that weeks later, in a completely different state, Tyler saw something that looked exactly the same. Across the United States, hikers and campers occasionally report seeing deer that behave in unusual ways. Some accounts describe animals that watch humans without fear or move with unnatural posture or limb motion. In areas of Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, such sightings sometimes become connected with skinwalker folklore. These stories often describe animals that appear normal at first, but behave in ways that seem slightly wrong. However, wildlife experts point out that deer suffering from injuries, neurological illness, or environmental stress can sometimes move strangely or appear unusually thin or tall due to malnutrition. What keeps stories like this circulating is when people claim the same animal appears again later in completely different locations. Whether these incidents are simply misidentified wildlife or something more unusual remains a topic of debate among campers and outdoor workers who spend long periods in remote wilderness. I worked in the oil fields of West Texas for about 6 years. Most of that time I worked maintenance on pump jacks and pipelines. The job usually involved long shifts in remote areas where you might spend an entire night alone checking equipment miles from the nearest town. A lot of people imagine oil fields as big industrial areas full of workers, but many sites are nothing like that. Once the drilling phase is over, some wells operate with very little human presence. One worker might drive a route between several pump jacks, checking pressure gauges, valves, and motors to make sure everything is running properly. In 2020, I was working a night shift rotation for a small company outside Midland. My route covered several wells spread across a large area of desert land. Most of them were connected by dirt roads running between mesquite bushes and dry fields. I usually started around 7 o'clock in the evening and worked until about 5 o'clock in the morning. During those shifts, I might see a few coyotes, jackrabbits, or sometimes deer wandering near the equipment. Wildlife wasn't unusual in those areas because the wells were built far away from towns. For the first few months, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Then one night in early October, I noticed something watching me while I was checking one of the wells. The pump jack was located about 2 miles down a dirt road from the highway. I had just finished recording the pressure readings when I noticed movement near the fence line around the well. At first I thought it was a coyote, but when I looked closer, I realized the animal was much larger. It was standing near a group of mesquite bushes about 50 yards away. The shape looked like a large dog or maybe a wolf, although wolves aren't common in that part of Texas. What caught my attention was that the animal wasn't moving. It was just standing there watching me. Normally animals in that area keep their distance from people, especially when there's noise from machinery. But this one stayed in the same spot the entire time I worked at the well. After about 10 minutes, I got back into the truck and turned the headlights toward the bushes. The animal was still there. The light illuminated it enough for me to see that it was tall and very thin. The legs looked longer than a normal coyote's legs. The animal stared directly into the headlights for a few seconds. Then it turned and ran into the darkness. I didn't think much about it after that. There are a lot of stray animals and wild dogs around oil fields. But 2 nights later I saw the same thing again at another well site about 5 miles away. I was stepping out of the truck when I noticed something standing near the edge of the light. It was the same kind of animal, tall, thin, and standing completely still. This time I paid closer attention. The posture looked strange. Instead of standing with its head low like most dogs or coyotes, the animal held its head higher, almost level with its shoulders. It didn't run away immediately either. It stayed there watching me for several seconds before walking into the dark. Over the next week I saw the animal 2 more times. Each time it appeared near a different well along my route. That was the part that started bothering me. My route covered almost 20 miles of dirt roads. It didn't make sense that the same animal would keep appearing at different sites miles apart during my shift. One night near the end of October, something happened that I still think about. I arrived at a well around midnight to check the motor and pressure valves. The area was quiet except for the steady clanking sound of the pump jack moving up and down. As I walked toward the control panel, I felt the kind of uneasy feeling you get when someone is watching you. I turned around and scanned the area with my flashlight. At first I didn't see anything. Then the beam passed over something standing near the far side of the well pad. The animal was there again, but this time it was closer than I had ever seen it before, maybe 20 yards away. The flashlight beam caught its eyes, and they reflected back with a dull shine. The body looked even thinner than before. The legs seemed unusually long, almost too long for the body. What happened next made me uncomfortable enough that I left the site early that night. The animal took a few steps forward, but the way it moved looked wrong. The back legs bent in an awkward direction as it walked. It almost looked like the joints were positioned differently than in normal animals. Then something else happened. For a brief moment the animal stood upright, not fully like a person, but high enough that the front legs lifted slightly off the ground. It only lasted a second before it dropped back down and walked slowly toward the bushes. I stood there frozen for a moment trying to process what I had just seen. Then I got back in the truck and drove to the next well without finishing the inspection. After that night, I started paying more attention whenever I arrived at a site. Sometimes I felt like something was nearby even when I couldn't see it. Once or twice I caught movement in the distance, but I never saw the animal clearly again. About a month later, I mentioned the experience to another worker named Travis, who had been in the oil field business for almost 20 years. I expected him to laugh it off. Instead, he nodded like he had heard something similar before. He told me that workers around West Texas sometimes report seeing strange animals near pump jacks late at night. Usually they describe something that looks like a coyote or a dog, but moves in unusual ways. Travis said most people just assume it's a sick animal or some kind of hybrid stray dog. But he also said there are old stories in parts of the Southwest about creatures that take the shape of animals. He didn't go into much detail after that. I finished that job in early 2021 and moved on to another company closer to Dallas. Since then, I haven't worked night shifts in remote oil fields. But sometimes when I see videos of coyotes running across open desert, I remember the way that animal moved, because no matter how many times I try to explain it logically, I have never seen a coyote stand up the way that one did. Oil field workers across Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma often spend long hours alone in remote areas during overnight shifts. Because pump jacks and well sites are spread across large distances, workers frequently report unusual wildlife encounters. Some sightings involve animals behaving in ways that seem unnatural, such as approaching equipment without fear or moving with unusual limb motion. Wildlife experts sometimes explain these cases as animals suffering from injury, disease, or genetic abnormalities. However, among oil field workers, there are also long-standing stories about strange creatures seen near pump jacks late at night. These stories often describe tall, thin animals resembling coyotes or wolves that appear repeatedly at different sites along a worker's route. Whether these encounters involve misidentified wildlife or something less easily explained remains uncertain. Most workers who experience them simply avoid discussing the incidents openly and continue their shifts as normal. Hunters use trail cameras for a simple reason. You place them deep in the woods, leave them for weeks, and when you come back, they show you what animals pass through the area. Most of the time, the photos are exactly what you expect. Deer, raccoons, coyotes, sometimes a bear. But a few years ago, a hunter in northern Arizona checked one of his cameras and found something that didn't look like any animal that should have been there. The strange part was not just what appeared in the photos. The strange part was what happened the next time he went back to that location. I'm Brian. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I've been hunting in the forests north of town since I was a teenager. The area is mostly pine forest with a lot of public land where hunters can set up trail cameras before deer season. In 2022, I placed 3 trail cameras along a game trail that ran through a narrow valley about 20 miles outside town. The trail was easy to find because it passed through a natural clearing between 2 ridges. Animals moving through the forest tended to funnel through that area, which made it a good spot for a camera. The cameras I used were basic motion-triggered units that take a photo whenever something moves in front of the sensor. Usually I leave them out for 2 or 3 weeks before checking them. The first time I checked those cameras that season, everything looked normal. The memory cards were full of deer, elk, and a few coyotes moving through the clearing at night. Then something strange showed up on the second camera. At first glance, the photo looked like a deer walking across the clearing around 2:30 in the morning. But when I zoomed in on the image, I noticed something that didn't look right. The body shape was wrong. The legs were longer than normal deer legs, and the back looked almost hunched. The head was turned slightly toward the camera, but the angle made it hard to see the face clearly. I assumed the camera caught the animal mid-step in a strange position. Trail cameras sometimes produce distorted photos when animals move quickly through the frame. Still, I kept the photo saved on my phone because it looked unusual. 2 weeks later, I went back to check the cameras again. The first camera had the usual pictures of deer and elk. The second camera had several photos of the same strange animal. This time the pictures were clearer. In one photo, the animal stood in the middle of the clearing, looking directly toward the camera. The body looked thin, almost too thin for a deer. The legs were extremely long, and the joints looked like they bent at odd angles. But the most unsettling part was the head. The shape looked like a deer's head, but the neck seemed longer and the posture was wrong. It didn't look like a normal deer stance. It looked like the animal was standing in a way deer normally don't. I showed the photos to a friend who hunts with me sometimes. He thought it might be a deer suffering from a disease that caused muscle loss or joint problems. That explanation made sense at first. Animals with chronic wasting disease sometimes appear thin and weak, but something about the way this one stood didn't match that explanation. A few nights later, I checked the photos again more carefully. That's when I noticed something else. In several pictures, the animal appeared to be looking directly at the camera. Most animals ignore trail cameras completely because they don't notice them. But in these photos, the animal's head was always turned toward the camera lens, almost like it knew exactly where it was. That alone wasn't proof of anything strange. But the next set of photos made things harder to explain. In one image, the animal was standing normally on all four legs. The next photo was taken about 5 seconds later. In that photo, the animal appeared taller. For a moment, I thought the camera had shifted angle. But when I looked closely, the front legs were slightly lifted off the ground. It looked almost like the animal was rising upward. The picture was blurry because of movement, but the posture looked wrong for a deer. After seeing that photo, I decided to visit the location again and check the area around the camera. The clearing looked the same as always. There were deer tracks along the trail and some elk tracks near the trees. A few yards away from the camera, I noticed something unusual. There were tracks in the dirt that looked like deer prints, but the spacing between them was strange. Some of the prints were spaced much farther apart than normal deer tracks, almost like the animal took longer strides than a deer normally would. I replaced the memory card and left the camera running for another week. When I came back to collect it, the camera had captured only 2 photos during the entire week. Both pictures were taken on the same night. The first photo showed the clearing empty. The second photo showed the same animal standing at the edge of the trees, but this time it was closer to the camera than before. The posture looked slightly different. The back legs were bent in a way that made the body look taller than a normal deer stance. The head was tilted toward the camera. When I zoomed into the image on my computer, the eyes seemed to reflect the flash directly, but the reflection looked uneven. One eye was brighter than the other. That might not sound strange, but it gave the animal an unusual expression. After that photo, the camera didn't capture anything else. No deer, no coyotes, nothing. Just those 2 images. I eventually removed the cameras at the end of the hunting season and stopped checking that area. A few months later, I ran into another hunter at a local outdoor store in Flagstaff. We started talking about trail cameras and wildlife sightings. At one point, he mentioned that he had captured photos of a strange deer-like animal on one of his cameras the previous year. The location he described was only about 15 miles from where my cameras had been set up. When I showed him the pictures on my phone, he stared at them for a long time. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said the animal in my photos looked almost exactly like the one he saw in his. Neither of us had a clear explanation for what it was. Maybe it was just a severely malnourished deer with unusual proportions. But after studying those photos for months, I can say one thing with certainty. I have seen thousands of trail camera images over the years, and none of the animals in those pictures ever looked quite like the one standing in that clearing. Hunters across the United States frequently use trail cameras to monitor wildlife activity. Because these cameras operate automatically at night, they sometimes capture images that appear unusual or difficult to interpret. Many strange-looking animals photographed by trail cameras are later identified as deer suffering from disease, injury, or extreme weight loss. Camera angles and motion blur can also distort body proportions, making animals appear taller or thinner than they actually are. However, in parts of the Southwest, especially in Arizona and New Mexico, some hunters believe that certain strange animal images may connect to regional folklore involving shape-shifting entities often associated with skinwalker legends. While there's no scientific evidence supporting these claims, stories about unusual deer-like creatures continue to circulate among hunters who spend long periods monitoring remote forests with trail cameras.